Okay, we're going to get started. So today's talk is the potential habitat for invasive crayfish in the Great Lakes under current and future climates. My name is Greg Hitzroth. I am the moderator for today's webinar. This is the fourth Invasive Crayfish Collaborative webinar in the series. We will be saving questions until the end of the webinar. But until then, we will be listening to Reuben Keller, who is an associate professor in the Institute of Environmental and Sustainability at Loyola University Chicago. His research looks at all stages of invasion, from how species are introduced and become established to the interactions they have with other species. He's particularly interested in the arrival, spread, and impacts of invasive crayfish in the Great Lakes region. Reuben earned a PhD in ecology from the University of Notre Dame. And with that, I will unmute Reuben and let's see. Ooh. How do I turn on your video, Reuben? Oh, there you go. I think you might have to start your video. Okay, perfect.
Okay, can you see my screen and hear me, Greg?
Yep, I can see your screen and hear you. Just need you to share your slides and.
Oh, this slide's not coming up as shared?
Mm-mm. Okay. Okay, perfect.
Okay. Well, thank you to Sea Grant for inviting me, and to everyone for being here to listen to me. So I'm going to be talking about potential habitat for invasive crayfishes in the Great Lakes under current and future climates. So this is work that I've done in collaboration with Rachel Egley, Erin O'Shaughnessy, and in particular, Victoria Prescott, who was a postdoc in my lab. Did a lot of, in fact, did most of the modeling work. And all of this work has been done here at Loyola University Chicago in the Institute of Environmental Sustainability. So today, I'm going to briefly review crayfish in the Great Lakes, which is kind of a why should we care about this section. I'll then talk about some of the difficulties inherent in predicting crayfish distributions. It turns out that crayfish distributions are really difficult to predict, even relative to other taxonomic groups. And then I'll talk about the predictions that we have made for future distributions of crayfish in the Laurentian Great Lakes. So first of all, in the Great Lakes, there have been 13 species of crayfish recorded, of which 3 are non-native to all Great Lakes. The Allegheny crayfish, which is found in Huron and Ontario, the rusty crayfish, which is now found in all 5 Great Lakes, and the red swamp crayfish, which is found in a persistent population in Lake Erie. There may be a persistent population in Lake Michigan. It's certainly found in inland waterways and water bodies very close to Lake Michigan. There are also 2 native species which have been spreading over recent time. The calico crayfish has been spreading in Lake Michigan, and the northern clearwater crayfish has been spreading in Lake Superior. And if we look to inland lakes and waters, then the northern clearwater crayfish is considered an early invader of many inland lakes across the Great Lakes region, but it's one that's been largely replaced by rusty crayfish. I'm sure everybody on this webinar has heard of rusty crayfish. It's the big bad crayfish around the Great Lakes region. It's found in many inland lakes. It's found in all of the Great Lakes. And it is considered most likely that it has not only gotten rid of some locally native species, but it's also gotten rid of, in many lakes, the northern clearwater crayfish in places where that species was an earlier invader. Okay, so rusty crayfish, native to the Ohio River Valley. It's been spread around the Great Lakes region, the Great Lakes themselves and inland lakes. Largely, we think, as a result of bait release. It then has the ability to spread by itself, to spread naturally once it becomes established. And it has a lot of impacts. It predates fish eggs, it displaces and hybridizes with native crayfish, and we know, at least in inland lakes, that it can reduce invertebrate and macrophyte populations. What we don't know a whole lot about is its impacts in the Great Lakes proper. We know that it is spread, we know that it can have some impacts, but those systems are simply enormous, of course, and it's very hard to figure out in such large complex systems what's going on and what sort of larger level impacts rusty crayfish might be having, but there's no reason to think that those impacts are small. So they've spread throughout the Great Lakes, as I said. That spread has been particularly rapid from the 1990s onwards. These figures come from Jodie Peters with a long list of collaborators who published in 2014 currently the most up-to-date data about the distribution of crayfish in the Great Lakes. So these open squares are places where native species were found during each of these periods. And when you start seeing some darker diamonds, those are where rusty crayfish were found during those periods. So you can see that through until 1990, rusty crayfish were reasonably rare around the Great Lakes. But then during the 1990s and the 2000s, they spread enormously. They began to turn up much more widely. So rusty crayfish is very well distributed around the Great Lakes, but it remains a relatively recent invader. The last couple of decades have been the really important ones for its spread. More recently, there's been a lot of concern about the red swamp crayfish. This is native to the southern US, the sort of yellowy brown color on this map. It's a global invader. It's found in Africa, Asia, Europe, where it has very large impacts. It's been long established in a small population in wetlands to the west of Lake Erie, possibly also in Lake Michigan, and it's begun to be found in quite a few ponds, and in our case, where I've been working on it here in Illinois, also in some canals in Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, and Minnesota. And the assumption is that it's begun to spread recently. And I think that's a pretty reasonable assumption, but it's one that, because there has been relatively little crayfish sampling around the Great Lakes, it's impossible to say how long these populations that are now being found, how long they've been established. But I personally think it's reasonable to think that it's been spreading at least over the last couple of decades. It hasn't been around too much longer than that. And there are many more potential invaders. Some of these you may have heard of: the marbled crayfish, otherwise known as marmocrebs. This is this pretty amazing organism that seems to have evolved within the pet trade to be parthenogenetic. That means you can have whole populations that are just females, and they have no problems, apparently, producing offspring. The Redclaw crayfish has gotten a lot of attention. It's a large Australian crayfish, very attractive. It's being bred for the pet trade. It's also being moved around for the aquaculture trade. The Yabby, I don't have a picture of that up, related to the Redclaw crayfish. It has a large distribution in Australia, is now invasive in Europe, and it's also, as I said, a larger crayfish. It's very attractive for the aquaculture trade. Signal crayfish in the aquaculture trade, invasive in Europe. And then there are many more species that are involved in various trades, the pet, live food, biological supplies, and so on trades that are being moved around the world that are potential, that have potential to be released in the Great Lakes region. If they get released, it's natural to start asking questions about, well, are they likely to be able to become established? And that's what is driving the work that I'm talking about today, that question. So in summary to this opening, rusty crayfish is well established with high impacts in inland lakes around the Great Lakes region and beyond. It likely has high impacts in the Great Lakes themselves, although it's very difficult to do the ecological work in those really large systems to figure out exactly what those impacts are and how large they are. Red swamp crayfish appears to be spreading. There are many more potential invaders, and there are many active vectors. So again, this question of what are crayfish invasions likely to look like in the Great Lakes going forward is a very relevant question for science and management. We should expect, in fact, it would be ridiculous not to expect that the species involved, that their ranges, that the types of impacts they're having, those are going to change, right? We know that they're going to change over coming decades, and we'd like to be prepared for that. So this leads us to the question of, well, let's try and make some predictions, right? Let's try and identify which species are most likely to come in, which existing species are going to spread, which are going to contract, where they're going to spread to, where they're going to contract from. So that leads us to this question of, well, how do we predict current, perhaps, so potential for spread under current climates, and also potential for future spread of crayfish distributions. So this is the map showing the native range, again in the yellowy beige, of rusty crayfish, and those areas of the United States where it is known to be established. And the thing to notice from this, the reason that I put it up, is that usually when we're doing modeling of potential distributions, we rely largely on climate. And the way that we do that is we take the existing range of a species and we project that onto other areas, and we ask whereabouts is the climate similar to where we know that it can currently exist. And if you look at this map, and it's pretty clear that knowing where rusty crayfish is native does not give you a good description of the types of climates where it has shown itself to be capable of establishing, right? It's native to parts of the Ohio River Valley, but it's now found as far north as Lake Superior in northern Minnesota. So these are areas that, based on the native range, we would not have predicted that this species could become established. And we certainly wouldn't have predicted, and this is a photo of me about 30 feet down out in Lake Michigan last summer, holding a rusty crayfish. We certainly wouldn't have predicted that it could survive and indeed thrive. We find very large populations of rusty crayfish in Lake Michigan. We wouldn't have predicted that it could survive and thrive in those conditions either. The same is true for the red swamp crayfish. Again, if we look at the native range of this species in the yellowish brown, it stretches across a pretty warm region of the United States, and it extends into Mexico. And if we use that to predict where this species could become established, then we certainly wouldn't predict that it would have been existing at the western edge of Lake Erie for several decades. That it wouldn't have become established in Wisconsin near Milwaukee, and it wouldn't be established in a system like this one, which is where we are currently working on it. So this is a part of the Chicago area waterway system. It's the North Shore Channel, and it freezes over for weeks or months at a time during winter. It will have a really thick layer of ice over the water, and it's only about 9 feet deep in the middle of the channel. So the native range of red swamp crayfish would never make us believe that it could become established in this sort of habitat. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that native distributions are not restricted entirely by climatic factors, right? That's a no-brainer after looking at what we've just looked at with rusty and red swamp crayfish. So other things must be important. Those other things are probably going to be species specific, right? So there might not be general rules that we can apply, but they're likely to be things like physical barriers to movement. Can the species get from one river system to another, or one lake to another? So that might have prevented its spread in the past rather than climatic constraints. Biological interactions, the existence of predators, competitors, diseases, and parasites might limit the spread of these species. And then when they're released from those, perhaps by being moved to a new area, they might be able to thrive, even though that new area might have a very different climate. And it's also possible, and there are some really cool new results that support this idea for rusty crayfish. It's possible that when these species get moved into a new habitat, they can evolve really quickly. So they effectively become different to what we see in the native range in ways that allow them to survive and thrive in new climates, and perhaps dealing with new predators and new competitors. And there may also just be the effect there that within a population, you have some sort of population structure within a native population. So it may be very important where the individuals that are moved are selected from, where they're taken from in that native population, because some of them may be able to deal with very different climates while others may not. So this type of information gets a person like me with interests like mine, gets me down a little, right? Because we have really good climate data. We have good global climate data. We have good predictions of what climates are going to be like in the future. We can predict the ranges of species based on climate. What we're not good at, simply because we're dealing with really complex systems and we just don't have the data, is dealing with or trying to identify where things like physical barriers or these biological interactions, or even harder than that, where evolution might take over and have a strong influence on where and when and how a species is going to move. So this type of information, which we know can be very important, is simply not available. And others have shown, so I'm not the first one to beat my head against this, problem and to get a little down about it. Others have shown that not only is predicting potential ranges of crayfish difficult, it's actually more difficult than for most other taxa, right? So when we're trying to predict ranges, we're not just dealing with a difficult problem, the difficult problem of predicting where species will spread. We're dealing with it for a particularly difficult taxonomic group. Crayfish are difficult. But what do we know? I think one of the best papers that's looked at this has been Erik Larsen and Juliana Olden's paper from 2012 in Global Ecology and Biogeography. They took red swamp and signal crayfish. These are two North American natives, which have both good data about their native range and for which they've also invaded widely, and we have good data about their invaded range. And they asked, well, if we try and make predictions for where these species can exist, and if we make those predictions based only on their native range, how do those predictions work out compared to if we use native plus invaded range, right? If we use the full range of the species. So they put together these models of regions of the world that would be climatically suited to these species based on those two different approaches. And these models were based only on air temperature. So they just looked at temperature variables globally. And what they found was that for signal crayfish, the models were roughly equivalent. So if you take just the top part of this figure here, which is the model produced using just the native range of signal crayfish, and you compare it to the map and the heat map below, which is using the total range, so that's native plus invasive, and you can see that these maps are very similar. Both of these approaches performed very well. They produced maps very similar. So the predictions that you'd make are similar, whether you use just native or native plus invaded range. So in this case, there doesn't seem to be too much that has changed for this species by being taken out of its native range and spread around. It seems to be pretty consistent. In contrast, when they did this for red swamp crayfish, they found that the native range was much, much narrower than the invaded range. And when you added in the invaded range, you got much broader predictions of which regions of the globe are climatically suitable for red swamp crayfish. And those predictions turned out to be a lot better because they have all of this, well, they had all of these data about where the species was established, and they could apply the predictions to that. So in the case of red swamp crayfish, using data from the invaded range really helped. And what does that tell us? It tells us that in the case of red swamp crayfish, things are different outside the native range, right? The native range is not a good climatic distribution, or it is not a good climatic description of where the species can become established. In the case of signal crayfish, it was. So again, this emphasizes the difficulty of applying this to crayfish, right? Even within crayfish, not all species behave the same when they move out in relation, or when they move into a new range. Not all species remain the same in relation to their climatic envelope. So what should we conclude from this piece of work? Certainly use native plus invaded range data to develop models of potential distribution when those data are available. So of course, that's not a very useful recommendation if we're looking at a species that has not yet become invasive, right? There's no invaded range data by definition. But if there are those data available, they should be used. For red swamp crayfish, they improved the predictions. For signal crayfish, they made no difference, so you may as well have them, or they made little difference. It also tells us that if we're applying models to a species with no history of invasion, we probably should build in some expectation that the thermal niche, that the range of temperatures that species can deal with is going to expand. This is essentially saying for crayfish, because they do tend to be constrained, we think, by factors above and beyond temperatures, we should expect that when we move them out of their native range, the range of temperatures that they can deal with is going to be larger than what they experience in their native range. Okay, so there has been, I'll go back to this one. There has been other good work done, but I didn't want to go into a huge sort of literature review. But what I hope I can conclude from this is that predicting where crayfish are going to be in the future under models of climate change is difficult. And it's an inherently difficult problem. Crayfish are even more difficult than the average taxa. But there are ways that we can do it. And Eric Larson and Julian Alden in the paper, in a section of that paper that I'm not going to go into today, they showed that you can actually systematically incorporate this expectation of an expanded thermal niche. So there are ways to do it. Okay. Now we get to the actual work that has been done in my lab, making some predictions for habitat for crayfish in the Great Lakes. So again, why is this important? We know that invasive crayfish and native range expanders have been have driven important environmental and economic changes over recent decades. We know that's true. We know that these species are continuing to spread. We know that some species are contracting. So we should see these environmental and economic impacts change over time. And this is going to be compounded by future climates, right? We're already seeing effects of climate change. Those effects are going to magnify over time. This may allow new species to become established. It may drive some native or invasive species out of the system, or it may functionally drive them out of the system by pushing them to very low population levels. And ideally for management and also for science, we'd really like to know what's going to happen so that we can be prepared for that. Some brief background on climate change. As I said, we're already seeing climate change in the Great Lakes region. Lake temperatures, water temperatures have increased pretty remarkably. From 1976 to 2006, they increased by 2.5 degrees Celsius. That has resulted in much less ice cover. And this figure here shows change in ice cover from 1973, average ice cover from 73 to 92 compared with 93 to 2012. And you can see that for all of those Great Lakes, including the Great Lakes Basin in total, ice cover has gone down. This is a big change to a big system. Precipitation has gone up across the Great Lakes since 1900. It has been enormous this summer in the Chicago region. It's slowed down our fieldwork quite a bit because everything's been in flood for a long time, but also as a general trend, precipitation is increasing. And the amount of snow seems to be declining by about 3 inches per year. So some really significant changes in climate, and those changes are only going to speed up over time. So the question that we've asked is, how will climate change alter the potential for non-native crayfish to invade the Great Lakes? And how will the ranges of those current invaders change due to climate change? So we began by picking out 3 species distribution models. So these are basically modeling approaches to take the known climatic range of a species and to project that into the future under climate change. So the 3 that we chose are, and I'll talk about each of these a little more in subsequent slides, but the Risk Assessment and Mapping Program, RAMP, which was developed by Fish and Wildlife Service, and then the other 2, Boosted Regression Trees and Maximum Entropy, MaxEnt, are both machine learning, very computationally intensive modeling approaches to do this, to take existing climates and to try and project those into the future. We took 30 species of concern in the Great Lakes, fishes, mollusks, crayfishes, and plants. I'm only going to talk about the 7 crayfishes that we worked on, but we're working on publishing this paper, so you'll get to learn more about those other species down the track. We looked at occurrence points from the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. So to make these projections, you need to know where the species exists. So we took those from gbif.org. Then we ran the models using training and validation subsets. So you take a random selection of all of the occurrence data. You build the model based on that selection, and then you apply the model to the held out species, the validation subset, which is, well, not species, validation occurrences. So you build a model based on some of your occurrences, and then you apply it to the rest so that you can get an idea of how well that model works. And then we compared these 3 different approaches using a thing called the true skill statistic, which I will talk about more in a moment. So the first method that we used, as I said, it was developed by Fish and Wildlife Service. It was developed to be applied to North America. So it only sort of natively produces predictions for Mexico, the US, and Canada. Although we were able to to expand that so that it could produce global predictions. It's implemented in ArcMap, and it's a pretty relatively easy, rapid method for assessing climate similarities. You can do it for current 2050 and 2070 time periods. You can zoom in on the US, Canada, Mexico, Great Lakes Basin, the Caribbean and Central America. The background data that it uses are 16 bioclimatic variables, the same ones that are used by the Climatch, the Australian program, and you can apply it for these different climate scenarios. And those different climate scenarios are known as representative concentration pathways. These are what's produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And these are projections of climate change under different greenhouse gas concentrations in the future. And they go from 2.5, which is a low level of change, to 4.5, intermediate level, and 8.5, which is a high level of climate change. So within RAMP, it's a really cool program. It's very easy to make these projections, and then you can play with your time horizon and with your RCP to see how that changes. Boosted regression trees and maximum entropy have been used more often, certainly in the academic literature, to create these species distribution models. They generally perform really well. So they're machine learning approaches. They use a computer's ability to learn as it works through the data and then as it reworks through the data. So they're really quite powerful, and they often find patterns in data that traditional statistical approaches just can't. The drawback of these is that you need quite a bit of expertise to run them. And then once you get the code up and running and it's doing what you want, it can take all night and most of the next day to create a map for you. So they're very computationally intensive. And we compared these because we wanted to know which models were performing the best. We compared them using a thing called the true skill statistics. This is where you take your training data, this random subset of data, and you produce your model, and then you apply it to the validation data. And what the true skill statistic does is it takes your true positive rate, so that's a number between 0 and 1, and that's how many times do you correctly predict an occurrence, plus your true negative rate, that's again between 0 and 1, how many times do you correctly predict an absence, and then you subtract 1 from those two. So the maximum score that you can get is 1, right? It'd be 1. So perfect true positive, perfect true negative, that's 1 plus 1, then minus 1 leaves you with 1. If you get a score of 0, then you have no predictive ability. And if you go too much below 0, then you're dealing with something that's actually worse than random. But that's the true skill statistics. It's been used before to compare these types of models, and it's a generally accepted approach. So one of the difficulties that comes up, though, when we're dealing with species distribution models is that we have to come up with this true negative rate. When the data that we're dealing with, and in the case of crayfish, the data that we have are presence only. We just don't have people reporting that they comprehensively surveyed a site and they did not find an organism. So the way that we create negative data is by looking at regions nearby to presence data where we don't have records, and then classifying sites in there as negatives. So it's a way of sort of creating data. So we go nearby to sites with positives, and if an organism has not been identified at a specific site in there, then we call it a negative. So it's obviously not an ideal way to do this. We'd really like to have negatives, but it works really well. So in this case, you know, it's a system where kind of the proof is in the pudding, and that even though it doesn't make us feel great, we're sort of creating these data where data don't exist, it actually works very well. And people have done all sorts of tests to show that. So what we found when we applied these models to all 30 species and we looked at just their current range, right? So we can assess how well these models take the random subset that they use to create the model, how well that model then applies to the held out data. We found that RAMP produced was actually pretty poor according to true skill statistics, just a little above 0, while boosted regression trees and MaxEnt performed much, much better. So looking across all those 30 species, boosted regression trees and MaxEnt were statistically not different in terms of their true skill statistics, but RAMP performed quite a bit worse. So what we saw was that RAMP usually had a very high true positive rate. It was really good at predicting where the species is, but it had a very low true negative rate. So what it was doing is it was over predicting the potential range. And I'll talk more about that at the end. These numbers look really bad for RAMP, but in fact RAMP might, well, I'll talk about it now. RAMP might be only marginally over predicting. Remember that when we take our negatives, we go to places nearby to positives. And we say, well, we don't have a positive there, so we'll call it a negative. And again, that's worked well in the past for lots of taxonomic groups in lots of regions. But in the case of RAMP, it means that it might only be, its rate of overprediction might not be huge, right? So we could call it perhaps a conservative approach, right? We're going to make a reasonable prediction of where we think this species can be, and then we're going to expand that envelope a little bit. And in expanding that envelope a little bit, it then overlaps with all of these places where we've sort of arbitrarily set negatives. So there's more work to be done looking at RAMP and how that works, but certainly the way that we've done it here, RAMP performed much less well than boosted regression trees and MaxEnt. Okay. So we then wanted to go ahead and actually apply this to crayfish. Unfortunately, a lot of the species that we'd like to apply it to, and this is in particular the marbled crayfish, this parthenogenic species often called marmocrebs, we just couldn't apply predictions to that because we don't have enough data. We could come up with a map, but we'd point to that map and say, there are so many caveats on this. There's so much that we don't know that the map is essentially, not worth creating. And that's because although marbled crayfish is really concerning, although it's well distributed in the pet trade, and although there are some places where it's become established in the wild, those places are just too few to be making reasonable predictions for where else it could turn up. So because boosted regression trees worked best with our true skill statistic, we used that approach primarily. So all the results that I'll show are for that, using that mid RCP of 4.5. So we applied this to these 7 species: rusty, red swamp, yabby, stone crayfish, signal crayfish, redclaw, and the Murray crayfish. And I'll talk about each of these as we go through. So for rusty crayfish, when we take its full known range and we apply that to the Great Lakes, we see, not surprisingly, that the very large portions of the Great Lakes are very, very climatically suitable for this species, right? It would be remarkable if we found otherwise, because we know that the species is there. So that's looking at that current range, the top left. If we look at 2050 and 2070, then actually under these warming scenarios, our predictions are that rusty crayfish, or at least the current thermal habitat of rusty crayfish, is going to move north and overall contract by 2070. So if this is what happens, if the lakes warm in the way that is predicted, and if rusty crayfish stick to their current thermal habitat, then we are likely to see populations of rusty crayfish disappear from areas where they currently exist, and perhaps, overall populations to decline. Red swamp crayfish, for their current range, it looks remarkably similar to where we actually find them. We find them around the southern basin of Lake Michigan, and we find them in the western basin of Lake Erie, and then in some inland lakes as well. And over time, the area that is thermally appropriate for red swamp crayfish, based on where they're currently found, is going to expand. And it's not only going to expand, it's going to expand in a pretty big way. So again, unless red swamp crayfish do something unexpected, and as I've said, unexpected things often happen with crayfish, but unless they do something unexpected, then we should expect to see that red swamp crayfish over coming decades are going to not only remain a threat in those places where they're already established, but they're going to become more of a threat across the basin. The yabby is a really interesting species, not just because it's the first crayfish that I ever caught. I grew up in southern Australia, but it's a big crayfish. It makes all of our North American species look kind of wimpy, frankly. It's been moved around globally through the aquarium industry, through aquaculture. It's now established in fairly small populations, but established in Europe. It has been moved around in Australia, and it is considered a high risk of establishment and impacts in the US. It also has this large distribution in Australia. It lives in warm, small streams that seasonally dry up. It lives in lowland, warm streams, and it lives all the way pretty far up into the mountains, where it deals with streams that ice over, and where there's a lot of snow up there. So it has a really large temperature range in Australia. And it's possible also that it's that it exists more as a species complex than as a species. There might be quite a bit of genetic diversity amongst different populations which are found in these different climates. But if we look at this species, currently the boosted regression tree model shows that there is good reason to be concerned about it becoming established should it arrive. If it arrived, then according to this model, it would find thermal habitat that is quite appropriate. Over time, it's going to continue to find appropriate thermal habitat in the Great Lakes, although it will become slightly less appropriate and contract somewhat. But this is a species that there's been a lot of concern about. You can no longer import it into the United States. I don't doubt that at least many people have it in aquaria in the United States. So it's a species for which there's quite a bit of concern about. I think that concern should exist going forward as well. And our models really bear that out. It's a species that is, or that at least appears to be, thermally well adapted to Great Lakes conditions. The stone crayfish we included, partly because we wanted to include a European species. So this is actually a species which is in decline across much of its range, although it's also popping up outside of its native range. So it's both within its native range, it's in decline, but it's becoming established in some isolated places elsewhere. So it's a really interesting species. It currently has just a couple of specks of potential thermal habitat here in the Great Lakes, but those are likely to expand somewhat into 2050 and 2070. So the species according to this model, would see better thermal habitat around the southern basin of Lake Michigan, perhaps around the far western areas of basin of Lake Superior, and in parts of the lower peninsula. This species, I don't believe, is known from trade, so hopefully it's not going to get here and cause impacts, but it's one for which, although currently there's low potential, in the future there might be higher potential for it to become established. The signal crayfish, which I've already spoken about, native to the western United States, well established in Europe. By thermal habitat, it just doesn't appear to be a good match to the Great Lakes, now or into the future. So hopefully this is one that, that we don't need to be too concerned about becoming established. Redclaw crayfish, this is in the same genus as the Yabby, which I spoke about. It's another very large crayfish. It's also really quite beautiful, and it has been bred to have lots of different color morphs. It's similar to snakes and other reptiles in that way. People really like playing around with it to create different color morphs to keep in their aquaria. It has pretty consistently sort of middling thermal habitat here in the Great Lakes region, getting better over time. So much of the Great Lakes region appears to be at least, marginally appropriate for it currently. And as you can see, going through to 2050 and 2070, you get some more greens in there, which indicate that the habitat is becoming better. So this is a species for which there's a reasonable reason to be concerned. And again, this is, well, as I mentioned, this is in the aquarium trade. It's become established beyond its native Australian range in a few places, including recently in Slovenia. And again, it's a really large crayfish. It makes our native crayfish look very small. And the last one that we looked at was the Murray crayfish. Again, this is one that's been proposed for aquaculture, and you can see why. It's another really big organism. It has a somewhat similar range to the Yabby, although it doesn't get up into the mountains. So it's much more restricted. So although it covers that sort of similar areas of Southeast Australia, it's much more restricted to warmer lowland waterways. And this is reflected in the predictions. No appropriate habitat now, and only very small areas of slightly marginal habitat existing as far out as 2070. So this would be a species that, again, unless something surprising happened, we wouldn't have too much reason to be concerned about from a climatic point of view, Okay, so in summary, those species that are already in the Great Lakes and causing issues are going to move around, right? Rusty crayfish thermal habitat is going to move north, and it may disappear from southern areas of the Great Lakes at the same time that it's becoming established further north or spreading further north. Red swamp crayfish, there is no reason at all in what I've presented to be optimistic that it will slow down its spread. For potential future invaders, we get mixed results. Some already have good thermal habitat. Some will see good thermal habitat in the future. Some will never see good thermal habitat in the Great Lakes region, or at least never say never. I guess some won't see it, even looking out to 2070. But we also know that factors other than climate and climate change are going to be important, right? Crayfish are inherently difficult to deal with because we know that it's not just climate that affects where they can live. So our hope is that, that these climate change scenarios that we've put out there can lead to better policy and management guidance, and hopefully that can come down to species-specific decisions about which species should be allowed for the pet and aquaculture trades, for example. We showed that even making these predictions is, it depends what model you use, what time horizon, and what climate change scenario you use. And those are really management decisions, I think, as to which is most appropriate for the goal of that management agency. But it can all be done. Once you get the code written, or if you're using RAMP, it can be done very easily to look at these over different time horizons, different models, different scenarios. And the other thing, and I spoke about this at some length, is that not all distribution models are equal. And although RAMP performed least well based on the way that we ran this modeling, it's also true that it's the easiest to implement. You need the least expertise and the least time to implement RAMP. We found that it tended to overpredict the true range, but for the reasons that I spoke about, I think there's more work to be done to figure out by how much it overpredicts the true range. Okay, so crayfish invasions are often ecologically surprising in ways that we can't predict, right? The effects of competitors, predators, parasites and diseases can be really large, and that's well illustrated by what I showed for rusty and red swamp native ranges. Over the foreseeable future, we're going to see new invasions, right? There are species out there, inactive vectors. If history is going to be a guide, then we are going to see new species arrive. We're not only going to see that, but even if we could prevent all new species arriving, we've still got a lot to deal with in terms of existing species moving and perhaps changing, increasing their impacts over time. And that's what I have. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Reuben. That's a great presentation. So I may have mentioned this before, but we were saving questions towards the end of your presentation. If anyone who is an attendee has questions, you can type those into the Q&A box or even the chat box down at the bottom of your screen once you scroll your mouse over it. But we don't have any questions yet, but I have a couple for you, Reuben. So I hear a lot from aquaculturists and aquarium hobbyists about conditions in which crayfish can survive. Has that type of information from trade been incorporated into the modeling for distribution for crayfish? Or is there any thoughts about why or why not that information hasn't been incorporated?
Yeah, I have heard similar information. For example, one of the problems is, the problem is that a lot of that information is anecdotal. If you talk to different aquaculturists, then they can give you different temperature ranges for the same species. And that's based on, and it's not that they're doing bad work or that they're lying, it's just that they see perhaps different populations of the same species. They culture them in different ways. So yes, I hear that stuff anecdotally. It's very difficult to include in these types of models because it's anecdotal, right? Because those sorts of data are not always collected in the ways that that would justify us including them and making them important to model outputs. And those sorts of information are they're just not published in the places where they get peer reviewed to the extent that we would want to be including them. So I think that's the main reason that they haven't been included. I would love to work more with aquaculturists, because they do have a whole lot of information, and they know these species in ways that that the scientific community doesn't. So it's something I'd like to do, but then it becomes difficult again because of the constraints that if you are going to collect data that are going to be really high quality, then it's difficult to do so, and it changes what they do, and then you have these commercial considerations by these aquaculturists with details that they don't want to give up. So the short answer is no, it hasn't really been included, and that's for a bunch of reasons.
Okay. How do things like the North American crayfish plague factor into species selection for looking at climate modeling versus considerations for invasion? So I've often heard that crayfish plague in North America has actually helped keep some species out. Is that a concern when you're doing these modeling, or?
Yeah, so it's likely that the one that we looked at, the stone crayfish from Europe, those European crayfish species are the ones who've really seen the impacts of crayfish plague, and they've tended to do very, very poorly. So for the stone crayfish, and just for anyone listening, crayfish plague is a fungal disease of crayfish, which is endemic, widely distributed in the United States, or in North America. And North American crayfishes have evolved with it and don't seem to be affected by it at all. When you take infected crayfish well, what's been done is infected crayfish have gone to Europe, and it turns out that European native crayfish get wiped out. Whole populations disappear due to the plague. So the question is, if you bring species to North America, yeah, why won't they just get the plague and die out? So certainly European species, I think that would be not unlikely. The Australian species, I don't know of anybody who's exposed them to the crayfish plague. So we just don't know. And certainly some of those Australian species, the Yabby and the Redclaw, are established in Europe, where crayfish plague is now also established. And they seem to be doing okay. So they may have some resistance, but the short answer is I don't know. And I just don't think it's known yet. Although if anyone's on the line and can correct me on that, I'd welcome it.
Okay, thank you. Let me see. Another question. There haven't been any other questions that have been asked, so I'll just keep going for a little bit. So for the ramp modeling, you say it's over-predictive, but are there cases in which you would see ramp being the most useful model, like accessibility for less technical, like maybe like a first line of screening for a species? Or is there other ways which you think ramp modeling shouldn't be considered?
Absolutely, there are times when ramp is going to be the best approach. And what ramp is mostly being used for by Fish and Wildlife Service, well, that I'm aware of, is to do these rapid screenings of potential impacts from invasive species. And in that case, ramp is the only one of those models that we looked at where you can produce sort of many maps per day. MaxEnt and boosted regression trees, as I said, they're computationally very intensive. It takes a long time to produce a map, to produce a prediction. So I think that, yeah, there's absolutely a place for ramp. It is over-predictive, which when we assess that with the true skill statistic, it doesn't look great, right? But there are ways that as long as the operator is aware of what's going on, right, that might be okay. if you say, I am very consciously using a model that is over-predictive, and I'm doing that because invasions often surprise us, and I want to reduce the chance for surprise, right? I think that's fine, as long as the operators are aware of that and are very conscious and descriptive of the fact that that's bound up in what they're doing. So certainly, if you want to create the most accurate models, then boosted regression trees and MaxEnt, they just do better. But they're a lot more work, and because they're so accurate at taking a subset of the data, creating a model, and applying that to validation data set. Because they do so well, they don't really incorporate the fact that these species might surprise us and end up going further than we think. Okay, so in short, yes, there's a place for ramp. As with any modeling approach, you got to be aware of what it does, how well it works in different situations, the types of assumptions that it makes, and you've got to describe those as you try and describe the results.
Okay. In the vein of this being a collaborative, what kind of information do you think would benefit this type of work, like that you could ask for from the larger scientific community? So like what kind of information would you like to see being collected to help create better models?
Well, certainly, the more presence data that we have, the better, right? These models are only ever going to be as good as the data that go into them. So having the scientific community and going beyond the scientific community to citizen scientists, reporting what they find and getting that into sort of useful databases that we can then access. That's really useful. Over the long term, it would be great also to have negative data, right? To have, or data that, absence data. I looked for these species here or this species here, and I'm confident that it's not there. It would take a long time, but certainly over time, if we could build up enough of those data, then we could get away from this issue of having to create essentially the absence data when we do this modeling. So better data would be, better presence and perhaps absence data would be very useful. And I think there is, potential to work with aquaculturists and to try and incorporate some of what they've learned about these species into these models. But we've also got to remember that aquaculturists come to these questions from a very different perspective, right? They're in the game of producing as many high quality individuals as they can, as quickly as possible, as cheaply as possible. And that's not at all a criticism of them, that's the business. So what they discover about perhaps breeding cycles of species under different temperatures might not describe those extremes, right? Might not describe, well, the species can actually hang on here, even if it breeds slowly, or even if the individuals don't grow really large. So I think there's a lot of potential to work with them, but also, recognizing that they're dealing with a somewhat different system to the one that we're asking questions about.
Okay, those are all my questions, and we haven't had any other questions, so I think we're probably good to just end the webinar here. So thank you very much for your time, Reuben. It was a great presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
I appreciate everyone's time today to watch this webinar, and we'll be archiving it on our invasivecrayfish.org website, and I guess I'll see you all next time. All right, thank you. Have a good day.